Go for it. Okay, well, my name is Jacob Allee. I am from Classical School of Wichita, Kansas. I'm a fourth year teacher, so I don't want to purport that I'm the expert at anything here. I have been familiar with classical education a little bit longer than that. When I was at Junction City, Kansas as a youth pastor, I also worked for Cloud County Community College for a little while doing recruiting, and I actually came across Cair Paravel Latin School in my high school visits, and that was the first contact I ever had with a classical school. I remember reading my list. You got North High School, things like that, Central, whatever. And Cair Paravel Latin School, and I thought, what is a Cair Paravel? And I hadn't even read Narnia yet. I mean, it was just, it was terrible. But anyway, and I walked into that school and was within 15 minutes of being there convinced they should not go to the college that I was representing, that they were too good for that, right? And I was just blown away by what I saw. And at that point, my wife and I, we had, I think our son was probably not even 2 yet. And I asked for a packet of information when I left. And so, I since then I had studied up on classical education. We had started classically homeschooling my kids, and so I continued to do youth ministry for a number of years before I actually started teaching in a classical school. But I additionally want to just tell you that this is not like the expert telling you things that you need to know, okay? This is me engaging with some thoughts that I have and hoping to hear good feedback from you and us just kind of learning and growing together. And so I labeled this discussion the Trivium as a model for question making. And I want to, before I kind of get to the application side of things, I want to talk theory a little bit, right? Just like the Apostle Paul always starts off with theology before he gets to application. I want to talk a little bit of the philosophy of the Trivium before we get to doing some of this. And I may end up challenging a few conceptions, and I'm more than happy to be challenged in return, because I don't claim that I have this all figured out, but I do at the same time think that there are some conceptions about the Trivium that I've encountered that I'm not sure I think is really quite right. And so, as I'm sure many or most of you know, the word trivium comes from Latin tri, meaning three, and via, meaning road, right? And those were three roads meet. And I'm sure many of us have read Dorothy Sayers' The Lost Tools of Learning and have some familiarity with those kind of things. And the term trivium, it is applied to the threefold studies of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And these are to be considered the introductory disciplines of the liberal arts. And by introductory, I do not mean that they are simplistic or unimportant. I am saying that they're foundational. Dorothy Sayers actually in her essay says the trivium is by its nature not learning but a preparation for learning. In other words, grammar, logic, and rhetoric precede and undergird everything else. Okay? And so grammar is the study and acquisition of language and information. And we could talk about grammar proper, as in, we think about subject and verb and all the different parts of speech and things like that, right? But we want to see grammar in a little bit bigger way than just that. And I'm going to go into that more in a minute. But we have grammar, which is the study and acquisition of language and information. Logic is the continued study of language and information and applying reason to infer conclusions and premises, or from premises. Rhetoric is the continued study of language and information as well as logic, and it's the application of persuasion in oral and written communication towards the good. And I'm going to clarify more about what I'm saying about each of these three disciplines in a moment, but I hope what you may have noticed is something that I did there, which is to say that there's a logical priority to grammar, logic, and rhetoric. One must precede the other in a natural way. You've got to, grammar, you've got to learn to read and acquire certain basic information before you can start to reason, right? And you've got to learn to read and acquire information and reason before you can really begin to persuade. Okay, so there is a logical priority in these things. But what I want to point out is that you don't actually move past grammar. You don't actually move past logic. The Trivium has, I think, sometimes wrongly been mischaracterized as stages. And I know where this comes from, I think, and I'm going to analyze this a little bit real quick for us. But we've come to think of grammar as a stage, and logic as a stage, and rhetoric as a stage, and it almost has this implication that you get out of the grammar stage, and therefore you're done with grammar. And now you're in logic. And then you get out of logic, and you're done with grammar and logic, and now you're rhetoric, right? And I think that kind of exacerbates a wrong way of thinking about the Trivium. And so I want to challenge that a little bit, and I want to analyze kind of where that came from. So again, Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning. Now, I am not going to pick on Dorothy Sayers, okay? Because here's the thing. I've seen this conversation happening a little bit in our movement, and you have broadly, I hate to paint with a broad brush, but broadly you have two different groups. You have a group that's saying, well, Dorothy Sayers says that the Trivium is the three stages of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, right? And then you have the other group that's criticizing Dorothy Sayers and saying she was completely wrong about that. She's put us on the wrong foot about what grammar, logic, and rhetoric really are. And what I actually would like to say is actually Dorothy Sayers got it right, and we keep misinterpreting Dorothy Sayers. Okay, so here's what Dorothy Sayers actually does in the Lost Tools of Learning. She identifies three anthropological stages, meaning having to do with how people themselves mature physically and mentally, and we develop, right? And she says, she calls one the pole parrot stage, the pert stage, and the poetic stage. That's what she kind of talks about. And she says that children develop in these ways, and they happen to fit really nicely with the Trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Okay, so she makes this anthropological observation. Number one, young children are sponges for information. Now, we all know that's true, okay? If you've been around little kids at all, they're constantly soaking up information. And she calls this the pole parrot stage. And she says this pairs nicely with grammar, because grammar is the acquisition of language and information. What better time for children to soak in as much as we can give them of language, both English and Latin, right? And also to memorize things like timelines and chants of all different sorts. It's perfect time for that, right? Then, she says, okay, second anthropological observation, what we might call like the tweens, the tween age, right? They're starting to become really argumentative, right? They like to argue. So they might as well do it well. If they're going to argue, they might as well learn to argue with reason, right? And so she says, so since they're naturally going to do that thing, that happens to line up well with the study of logic, right? So why not pair those things together? Good, right? Anthropological observation number three, the older kind of teens, they can't help but express themselves about everything. You know, they want you to know what they think, you know, and she says, great. Let them do it with persuasion. Let them do it beautifully, right? Let's teach them rhetoric, okay? And so what Dorothy Sayers actually says in her essay, I think is perfectly good and true and right. But what I want to clarify is that Dorothy Sayers does not say the trivium is stages. She says people go through stages, and elements of the trivium line up really well with those anthropological stages that people go through. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay, so with that in mind, I think we want to think carefully about the trivium and realize that we're not trying to move past grammar, we're not trying to move past logic, and we're never going to graduate from rhetoric, okay? Grammar, logic, and rhetoric is in everything. Everything we seek to learn has a grammar, logic, and a rhetoric. So whether you are kindergartners, 4th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade, sophomores in college, a grad student, right? We want them to be using the tools of learning grammar, logic, and rhetoric in acquiring the skills of whatever discipline is being studied. So strange as it may sound, there is a grammar to grammar, and to logic, and to rhetoric. There is a logic to grammar, to logic, and rhetoric. And I bet you could say what I would say about rhetoric, right? There is a grammar, a logic, and a rhetoric to rhetoric, okay? And so students in our K through 6 kind of age range, we often call that grammar school, which is fine. And they focus upon sponging up information. They soak up a ton of information, and there's no better time to do it. And the grammar focus is on acquiring the information. We ask questions like, what is it? Just what is the case? What are the things that are there to know and apprehend with our minds, right? But even so, even though that might be the primary focus for these young children because of where they are at anthropologically and their maturation, we still at times ask them appropriate level logic questions. Why do you think that? You know? How did you come to that conclusion that you just came to, right? You know, and so logic is still in play. They're not maybe ready for the more abstract kind of stuff, but we do still start teaching them how to reason, and we want them to have a reason for the things they say and do. The same students are asked eventually when they've got some of the more basic skills of be able to write or to be able to speak at a certain level, right? We say, well, tell us a story, you know, take this story and put it, you know, in your own words, or write a short little story of your own, you know. We're teaching the elements of rhetoric, even at the earliest part of their learning. Even show and tell, right, can be rhetoric time in grammar school. This is this thing I have. It's wonderful. You should all want one. You know, I'm persuading you right now about how good this thing is, right? You know, and so there's elements of rhetoric in grammar school. Students in our 7th through 8th grades, sometimes 7th through 9th, depending on how your school breaks up, what you typically call your logic school, or everybody does it a little bit differently, but you know, they're generally grouped off as the logic students. We tend to teach formal logic in this age range, most of us do. And these students learn about fallacies in reasoning, how scarily common they are in everyday life around us, and unfortunately even in our own thinking. They learn how to make valid inferences toward conclusions so that we might know some things by certainty and other things by probability. They are taught to ask, why is it this way and not that way? And can these things both be true at the same time? And how do I know if this is correct? Whereas, you know, grammar is about acquiring information. Logic is about the proper ordering of information to draw correct conclusions. But these same students are asked to memorize definitions of terms, to learn about historical figures of importance in logic. They are expected to be able to parrot back rules of inference and so on and so forth. All of that's grammar, right? There's still grammar in logic. These same students are asked to consider the implication of practicing logic and are pushed to make logical arguments in favor of things, make an argument for perhaps God's existence, make an argument for the value of unborn human life. We can apply logic, but that has a rhetorical application towards persuasion, right? So as they're learning the tools of reasoning well, they're also learning where it's going, okay? And then students in our upper levels of school, they've begun to study formal rhetoric, composition, and also in speech. These students learn the tools of persuasion in writing and speaking. They learn about ethos and pathos and logos and how to appeal to an audience depending upon the setting. If we're doing our job rightly, they learn that people matter more than arguments, right? And that they learn that they are seeking to persuade always for the good, not just because they can. Which is the difference between a rhetorist and a sophist. They both have the same skills, same power of persuasion, but a rhetorist always persuades for the good, and a sophist does it for personal benefit or gain. And so, we're teaching these tools, but these same students, they continue to learn the grammar of communication. They learn to define what ethos, pathos, and logos mean. They read and mimic great speeches of history. They learn to rearrange these speeches and reuse them and argue against them. There's some of that logic coming into that. They see how syllogisms, particularly enthymemes, can be used as persuasive tools to captivate and draw people in and say, I know that truth with you, So there is grammar and logic in rhetoric. And so I'm not trying to belabor the point, but I want us to be able to think this way about everything we engage, that there is a grammar, a logic, and a rhetoric there. And so we don't ever move past this. And even, if a student becomes fully liberally educated, having both the trivium and the quadrivium, and they go on to study the higher things, according to the medieval worldview, the trivium was the basics, okay? And then you got into the quadrivium. So the trivium focused on language, and it was all very internal. The quadrivium focuses on number and space and time. So you've got the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, right? And so you're focusing on the world outside of you in awe, okay? But you use the trivium to access that. And once you have those 7 liberal arts, now you're ready to study, the real important stuff, theology and philosophy, okay? And so that was a basic education at least in the medieval worldview. So everything we study, whether it's literature, whether it's mathematics, music, theology, philosophy, even sports and video games, really, has a grammar, logic, and rhetoric. I mean, it doesn't matter what a person chooses to learn about. There are these elements there, and these are the tools to acquire what you need to know to be able to understand it, apply it, and tell others about it, okay? All right, I skipped a little bit around. I got to find where I'm at here. All right. All right, so yeah, all of that. In fact, let me just stop a second. Is there any questions at this point just about anything I said, or you have any feedback or want to challenge anything? I'm more than happy to let this be interactive. I've got something we can interact up in a minute, but I want to give an opportunity. Okay, all right, so all of that, I know I took a long time with it, but it's preliminary to what I wanted to really kind of talk to you about today, if I have any time left. Having kind of reoriented our thinking about the trivium, I want to suggest that we should employ the nature of the trivium to developing questions in our classrooms to help students acquire the information we are teaching them, think about it carefully, looking for truth, and to give them the opportunity to express their thoughts with persuasion for the good of all. So you should have a sample packet. If you don't, I've got some extras right here. I'll get you one. And so this is just a sample. We're not going to kind of go through the whole thing. But what I want you to see is how you could take any kind of reading or assignment, and there are ways, I'm very confident there are ways to apply this into outside of literature, but that's where I teach most of the time, you know. But there are ways to easily create lessons while utilizing thinking about the Trivium. And there is also ways that we can encourage our students to begin to learn how to ask good questions themselves. So as much as I'm going to show you an example or a model how you can create lessons like crazy very easily using the Trivium, I also want to highly encourage you to get your students to be the question makers many times as well, okay? So let's think about what grammar questions are in general. So if we're going to create questions for discussion, and you can think about this in a couple different ways. You can say, well, maybe I'm going to lead a Socratic discussion and I want to have grammar, logic, and rhetoric elements in all of my questions, so I'm going to pre-prep questions. So what are grammar questions? Well, grammar questions ask things like who, what, where, when, okay? And they're directly related to the text that's been read, okay? So they should basically have a 1-to-1 ratio question and answer. So this question should actually have a direct answer. It's not your opinion, it's not, you know, there's actually a correct answer to this question. Because they are acquiring information that is available to them. So in the handout, if you want to flip to the back, I gave you the whole reading, and you're more than welcome, if you like this, to use this if you want to. You can take it home, duplicate it, use it. It's Pliny the Younger, and this is 2 letters that he wrote to Tacitus about the eruption of Vesuvius. And so it's a short read, but it's very fascinating. So if you haven't read it, I hope you just, even for yourself, just do and enjoy it, because it's just really interesting to read. But if you flip kind of all the way to the back, the first part of the packet that I actually created has the bust of Pliny there. And you can go until you see on, I think it's page 10, it's numbered page 10, and it says grammar questions. So you can see some examples of this. And again, it's just basic. Who is the letter addressed to? What, according to Pliny, assures that his uncle will receive, quote, an everlasting remembrance? Okay? So they need to search the text to find these actual answers to these questions. It's pretty straightforward. I'm sure you do this all the time. I'm not trying to lecture you about the real basic things here. But we do want to have this element where they are just going and seeking it out in the text. And why is this important? Well, somebody pointed out to me not long ago that as I was talking about grammar, logic, and rhetoric questions, they pointed out, you know, this is a lot like inductive Bible study method. Has anybody ever done inductive Bible studies? Okay, so in inductive Bible study, you know, you read and you take in what's there, and you ask just what is the case, you know, what is it actually being said, right? Before you move on to interpretation, right? Which this, you know, if we could get more of our evangelical churches to do inductive Bible study, this would be fantastic, right? Because so often we like to move to interpretation and then application before we ever actually bothered to look at what Paul the Apostle or whoever was speaking said, right? But it's the same reason why it's important to ask grammar questions. I don't want to know what you think or why you think it until you can tell me what he said. Right? You know, I want you to be able to analyze and repeat to me the message of this text before you analyze it. Okay? And that's why grammar is so important when it comes to literature text. We want to make sure that they've actually read the text, They've understood the message of the text. They could kind of regurgitate to you what, in a nutshell, what this text is getting at and saying. And so that's what grammar questions are all about, is just making sure that I've kind of done a check. Did you really read this? Did you really kind of grip the main ideas in this? And I want to note, too, that all of this above, where I've got it labeled grammar questions, really from the very front to the date of composition all the way through the end of the grammar questions, all of that's grammar. All of that's grammar, right? Because this is information that they should acquire and become familiar with that's relevant to studying Pliny the Younger's letters to Tacitus, okay? So this is stuff that would be wonderful to be on a quiz, okay? Because we do want to quiz for grammar. Do they acquire the basic information, okay? Then if we move on to the logic questions. Let's see here. Logic questions seek to interpret the author's meaning and intentions based upon what he or she says in the text. You may also ask questions that compare the current reading with other things the author said earlier in the book, so as to draw out themes or extended arguments. In fact, you can even, and I didn't do any of this in the example, but because we wouldn't have had a frame of reference for it, but if you're in a literature class and you're now reading Pliny the Younger, but you just finished reading something from Livy or something like that, logic questions are a good time to do comparative questions, right, between your current reading and the last reading, so you're getting cross-pollination between books. Pliny says this, how would that be similar or dissimilar to what Livy said in this text right here, right? Yes?
Do you mind to back up and give that a little bit of definition of your logic question? Seek to interpret the author's point of view, and there was something else you said.
Yeah. These questions seek to interpret the author's meaning and intentions based upon what he or she says in the text. So, and again, I don't mean to harp on this, but that's really the whole based upon is really important, right? I mean, it's we want to let students be free and to challenge something or share their own thinking on something. That's great. But if they're going to interact with a text or another person, they have to do so based upon what that text or the person actually said, right? We can't let them just run willy-nilly off to whatever direction they want and do the whole, well, I feel like, just because. We don't allow that to happen. It always has to, and I guess this is a good way to think of it, is that grammar's your anchor. There are a basic set of facts, of informational content, which everything you do logically and everything you do rhetorically has to be faithful to, because that's your bedrock. So don't let them get completely detached from all that. And so, yeah, we can look at some of the logic questions here. Pliny describes the initial eruption cloud as having, quote, sometimes bright and sometimes dark spots. What most likely accounts for these differences in the cloud? Now, this may seem, you probably say, well, I can come up with that, but here's the opportunity for you. You could ask them for a syllogism here, okay? Well, okay, a volcano erupts. When a volcano erupts, it spews forth ash and fire, right? You have a volcano erupting, therefore you're seeing ash and fire, and so, it's a simple little exercise, but what it does is it says, okay, you can very quickly, without trying to do a syllogism, you can account for why there might be dark and bright spots in the clouds that he's seeing, right? But do you realize that you've already made a logical inference that you didn't even think about making? So go ahead and put it in a syllogism, right? Because we want students to see, actually, logic is eminently practical. In fact, you're using it all the time, even if you don't stop to think about it sometimes. For what purpose might Pliny the Younger have highlighted his uncle's decision to switch from scientific exploration to a rescue mission? So again, I know you probably haven't had a chance to look much through this reading yet, but at first, Pliny the Elder, who is the person who passes away in this story, I know, I gave it all away. No, but he sees this cloud of smoke billowing into the sky, and they're not sure what it is at first, and he has a whole naval vessels at his command, and so he says, well, as a man of inquiry, I'm going to go check it out and see what's going on, right? And then he realizes that people are in trouble. He kind of changes course from scientific exploration to rescue mission, right? Well, Pliny the Younger, who's writing the letter, his uncle is a great man. He's a man of the state, of the Roman state, right? He is powerful and influential, and so he is making his uncle, and he may have been a virtuous man, but he is definitely making it known that his uncle was a virtuous man, right? And so we might be able to ask, why would Pliny the Younger do that? And so you can allow students to, again, make an argument. Why do you think he would do that? What advantage is there to that, or so on and so forth. And then we could go ahead and jump down to the rhetoric questions. And rhetoric questions, they should allow the hearer to express their own thoughts on a topic brought up by the author. So I'll say that again. Rhetoric questions should allow the hearer to express their own thoughts on a topic brought up by the author. So questions of this sort should invite discussion as to whether or not we ought to agree with an idea presented by the author, or perhaps how an idea should affect us and the way that we live. But they're questions that are such that it allows for variegated expression of thought. There might even be disagreement amongst students in the classroom over these kind of questions, and it can spark debate. It can spark persuasive essays, all kinds of things. So if you look at the questions I've asked, just had a few sample ones here. Should we seek to highlight the virtue of the deceased as Pliny the Younger did for his uncle Pliny the Elder? Why or why not? Is that a thing we ought to do? Right? Is it when you think about funerals, when we go to funerals and you hear people person after person come up and say how wonderful this person was, and how, and oftentimes you think, they missed them, they loved them, that's true, and sometimes you think, but really, were they? Right? And so what is the value or what is the place of praising the virtue of the deceased? I think that's an interesting topic to discuss, right? Pliny describes his behavior during the eruption, stating, I know not whether I should call my behavior courage or folly, but I took up Livy, he actually refers to Livy, as if perfectly at my leisure. The deal in the story is that Pliny the Younger, who is the nephew of Pliny the Elder, stays behind a ways back from the eruption as his uncle goes to kind of explore and then try to help. And he and his mother are at this house, and the cloud is ever billowing bigger and getting darker and all this kind of stuff. And people are fleeing and running for their lives. And he takes up Livy and goes and sits out on the porch and kind of does some readings. And, he's showing confidence and boldness in his own way, And so the question is this foolish behavior? Is it brave? What do you think? Why? Why might he do that? Is there a good reason he might have done that, or is it just foolhardiness, right? This is a wonderful opportunity for debate and discussion. And here's the fun thing with rhetoric type discussion. Argue the side that you disagree with. That's okay. Like if I think he's actually an idiot, but what could I say to make him look like he's being a virtuous person right here? Not because we want to teach students to actually be sophists and argue for things they don't believe, right? But there is value in the ability to argue something more than one direction. If nothing else, when you have to argue for the truth, you might know how to argue against the people who will be arguing for what's a lie, right? So there is value in that. And so I also put, biblical reflection questions in here. I mean, I definitely like to, no matter what we're reading, always just try to at least make some sort of connection with Scripture. In this is, I just love this short story. I know you're going to as well. But he describes when it gets to the point, it's basically pitch black because of this eruption. And people are screaming, women and children, and people are crying out in fear that there are no gods. It's just it's very interesting. And so I said, well, let's read Revelation 16, where God is pouring out the bowls of wrath. How is this like that, and how is it not? Because Pliny was actually convinced in that moment. He says he was convinced in that moment the world was ending. Because actually he was a Stoic, and the Stoics believed that the world would end in fire. So many of those in that worldview were convinced that this was a world-ending event, and it did kill more than 15,000 people. So it was huge. So anyway, I'll just give you a couple more examples there as well. And so I'll give you just a few more thoughts of different kinds of assignments that you can spin off of from grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and thinking about it in this way. So, grammar assignments that you could do, obviously quizzes. We're all familiar with quizzes. And, I think sometimes I've gone back and forth personally on how much do you just want to quiz kids, is that what we do as classical? Is that very classical to do that, But I'm personally coming back to this point where I say, yeah, it's classical to quiz, okay? There's a grammar level component here that they just need rote information, and it should undergird everything else. So I think, having a quiz where you have not only are you going to include maybe some of those grammar questions that'll come back up again in the quiz later, but again, the information, date of composition, who's the author, where are they from, those kinds of things to help anchor it in history. I also, I noted on here, where's it at? Oh, well, I think this is kind of important to do too, where you give them a visual of where in the world this is happening. At least for me, it's easy to read a place and think Italy, yeah, okay. But to see it on a map of where it is today, this gives a frame of reference for saying, okay, this is a real place. Vocabulary, I try to, best I can, I try to say, okay, I teach a lot of 8th grade. What words are they probably just going to go, I don't know what that means, and they may not ask, so I try to draw them out so that they encounter them and learn about them. And in other words, I put number 8 on there on purpose, okay? Because I'm sure that your students are much more virtuous than mine, and that they would read a word like retard, and they wouldn't smirk, they wouldn't laugh or make eyes across the room at somebody else, right? But when there are words like that actually have real meaning in the story to slow or impede the progress of something, right? I just draw it out, and so we go, oh, that's funny. Stop. Yeah, okay. But I think it's important, we were reading Lord of the Rings recently, and they threw a faggot on the fire, and there's oh Lord, okay, no, but just deal with it, and realize that this is not what that means, and we can get over it. We're okay. Parallel information. This is something that I'm trying to do more of too. What else is going on in the world when this is happening? Give me some sort of frame of reference for other things, right? So the Apostle Paul was martyred around 64 to 68 AD, which means that Pliny the Younger was just a young child when Paul died. Possibly the Apostle John was the only apostle to survive to the date of the eruption of Vesuvius. Many scholars think John lives into the 90s AD. The Roman general Titus, under the reign of Vespasian, his father, destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, 70. And I do stuff like this too. I go between AD, Anno Domini, and I actually say in English the year of our Lord, because I want them to associate all of those things being the same. So I kind of intentionally mix those up so they're catching on to that. And obviously there's a lot more parallel information you could draw out there. Yes?
When you are working through this with your class, do you spend time doing all the grammar and then kind of move, or do you leave your questions kind of
yeah, and I'm open to thinking about that more. I do kind of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, in that way. there might be value in some sort of variegation in doing that, but I haven't really done it that way so far, but it might be worth thinking about. And like I said, I'm a working project here too. So have you had any experience doing it? Yeah.
I was just trying to think.
No, yeah. That's good. I guess even philosophically, I'm kind of a foundationalist guy, so I like to move from one solid thing and build on top of it. So it makes sense to me to do it this way, but there could be some value in. And I guess I would say this: like it's all. Some questions, especially, there's a real blurry line between how grammar, logic, or rhetoric is this. You know what I mean? Like they don't always all fit really in a nice, neat category. So I guess just kind of work with that. But so yeah, grammar assignments, quizzes. Obviously, I think we should be doing those. Students could provide a retelling of the events, but act as if they were there presently, like they were personally there, right? But they're still regurgitating the facts, the information, but that kind of makes it kind of fun. Memorization and recitation, they could memorize a part and recite it, okay? And again, I know we do a lot of that in grammar school, recitation stuff. I think we need to do that in upper school. In fact, I lament the fact that we stopped doing timelines. I really believe that timelines need to be something that we carry all the way through 12th grade. And I think that when a student graduates from one of our schools, they should still be able to put all of these books they've read onto a timeline and know exactly where it fits in history. And I think we've done a disservice by pouring so much time and energy during the grammar school, K through 6th grade, and then just dropping that. And I say that, and our school is still not really doing this yet, but it's something we're talking about. So, logic assignments that you could do, any of the information in any assignment, you could say, using this information, make some deductive arguments. Be creative, right? And so we can give some questions to work with. Should Pliny the Elder have gone closer to the eruption? Well, I can argue in favor of that. Yes, it's a moral duty to provide help to those who were able to help. Pliny the Elder was capable of helping others with the ships he had at his disposal. Therefore, Pliny the Elder had a moral duty to provide help, right? No, Pliny the Elder had a responsibility to see to the well-being of his own family. If a person leaves his own family, then he is not able to provide with them with proper protection. Pliny the Elder left his family, therefore Pliny the Elder was not able to provide them with proper protection, right? So you can imagine a lot of ways we can do this, but developing arguments based off of the grammar of the text, right? And this is good preparation for rhetoric, where we're going to start trying to persuade. I meant to bring you, I even got my students' permission to bring some examples, and then I forgot them. Medieval style of disputation. I started doing this assignment just really recently, and it has gone so well. Now this is probably like high school level assignment in my opinion, right? But so how many of you are familiar with and have read some of Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas? Okay, a couple, okay? So he does, he utilizes the disputation method of the day, okay? And I'll just write on here. But basically the way it works is there will be a statement, for instance, oh, that didn't work. Does God exist? Okay, it's actually usually not even in that. It says, we'll say, God exists, okay? They call them questions, but they're usually just statements. That's the way it works. All right, so God exists. That's our thesis. So we'll come up with the best objections we can to the existence of God. We're going to start, and we're not going to do him any favors by holding back, right? We're going to come up with the best existence we can or objections we can come up with against God's existence, right? So list those out.
And this is something the students do.
I've started having the students do this. My 11th graders did it just the other day, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was really cool to see them do this. So put your best objections, and it doesn't have to be 3, but that's just a good number. Then he does on the contrary. And I can, if anybody wants examples of this, really, you can leave me your information. I'd be happy to email this to you. On the contrary is where he cites an authority in favor of his own view. So this oftentimes for Aquinas is Aristotle. A lot of times it's a scripture reference. So in the one that we did recently, we were doing Machiavelli's The Prince, okay? And the question for debate was, should Christians utilize the principles of Machiavelli? Okay, and so, when you think about how Machiavelli is, he's kind of, shady, but he has some good thoughts sometimes, right? So, and, one of my students for the On the Contrary section quoted John Piper, and that was great. That, is a pastoral authority in that case, and others use scripture and then all kinds of different stuff. So it's cool. So, but yeah, the On the Contrary section is citing authority in favor of your position. In this case, God exists, all right? Then there's the I answer that. And this is where you do original argumentation. This is where you give your argument in favor of the thesis that God exists, okay? And then after that, you go back and you reply to objection 1, 2, and 3, okay? And head them straight on, right? So this is a great rhetoric level assignment, I think. And what it does is actually it involves all the different levels. The grammar, like the what is of the situation, the factual information of the situation. It invites you to make logical arguments both for and against the position, right? And then it ultimately defends one as true, to persuade that your view is correct, okay? And so this is a wonderful assignment. Now I know we're pretty much running out of time here, so.
Sorry, how did you have them do it in a group? Do they each get, like, there's a counter argument, an argument, or do they all create?
I have each of them do their own.
Okay.
So they all do an original one, but we will then kind of like see where everybody fell, like which decide, because I actually leave it up to them, because they can play devil's advocate. So if this is the topic, the existence of God, I am perfectly fine my students going with the position I'm going to argue against God's existence, right? And so then I kind of just split them up to see who went which way on the debate. And then we just kind of have a Harkness-style discussion on the topic, and they can draw from their papers that they've written to be able to debate the points, basically. And obviously, persuasive essays, persuasive speech, all these are rhetoric kind of ways to interact with text like this. So I know we're about out of time, and I really wanted there to be more time for question and answer, and so I apologize. But